I never thought I'd end up working as a night guard at an old cemetery. It wasn't my dream job, but I needed the money. The cemetery was old, with big ancient tombstones covered in moss. It was quiet, and at first, kind of peaceful. But that changed quickly. It started on my third night. Around midnight, I was doing my rounds, walking between the rows of tombstones. I had my flashlight, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. Suddenly, I heard something else. Whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it sounded like actual voices, soft and distant. I stopped and listened, but the whispers stopped too. I shook it off and kept walking. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, cemeteries are supposed to be spooky, right? The next night, the whispers started again. This time they were louder and seemed to be coming from all directions. It felt like dozens of people were whispering right next to me. I turned in circles, trying to see where the sounds were coming from, but there was nothing. No one. Just as I was about to leave, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing by a tall, old tombstone. It was too dark to see any details, but I could tell it was staring right at me. I called out, asking who was there, but the figure didn't move. I started walking towards it, but before I got close, it vanished. Just disappeared into thin air. I was scared, but I didn't want to lose my job, so I kept working. Each night, the strange occurrences escalated. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, the footsteps closer. Objects started moving on their own. My flashlight would flicker and turn off. My keys would slide across the table. Once, I found my security badge hanging on a tombstone, even though I knew I had left it in the office. One night, I decided to do a quick Google search about the cemetery. What I found frightened me to the core. The cemetery had a history of people vanishing without a trace. Over the past 50 years, several night guards and even visitors had gone missing. They were never found. I knew I had to figure out what was happening before I became the next victim. I started paying more attention to the whispers. They were still hard to understand, but I could pick out a few words. It sounded like they were saying, "Help us," and "Find him." I started searching the cemetery for clues. One night I found an old, crumbling mausoleum that I had never noticed before. It was hidden behind a row of tall, overgrown bushes. I pushed open the rusty gate and stepped inside. The air was musty, and the only light came from my flashlight. Inside, I found an old journal, covered in dust. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but I could still read the writing. It belonged to a night guard from many years ago. He had written about the same things I was experiencing. The whispers, the footsteps, the shadowy figure. He had been trying to solve the mystery too. His last entry was chilling. He wrote about finding the shadowy figure and trying to confront it. He said he had discovered its identity, a man who had been buried in the cemetery after committing horrible crimes. The guard believed the man's spirit was haunting the cemetery, trapping the souls of the people who vanished. As I read the last line, my flashlight flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. I heard the whispers again, louder than ever. They were angry, demanding. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. My flashlight flickered back on, and I saw the shadowy figure standing in the doorway of the mausoleum, blocking my way out. I gathered all of my courage and ran past it, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was out of the cemetery and back in my car. I knew I couldn't keep doing this job, but I also knew I couldn't just leave without trying to help the trapped souls. The next day, I went to the cemetery during daylight. I found the grave of the man mentioned in the journal. His tombstone was old and cracked, with his name barely visible. I said a prayer and placed a bouquet of flowers on the grave, hoping it would bring some peace to the restless spirits. That night, the whispers were softer, almost grateful. The footsteps were gone, and the shadowy figure didn't appear. I felt a sense of relief, but I knew I wasn't completely safe yet. I decided to quit the job the next morning, but I left with a heavy heart. knowing there were still mysteries left unsolved in that old cemetery. As I drove away for the last time, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the shadowy figure standing at the gates watching me leave. I don't know if the spirits found peace or if they're still trapped, but I hope that by sharing this story, others will be cautious. My friends and I always called ourselves fearless. We were the type of kids who watched horror movies without blinking and told scary stories around campfires. So, when the rumor about the haunted mausoleum started circulating around school, we knew we had to check it out for ourselves. It was said to be haunted by the ghost of a cruel caretaker who died under mysterious circumstances. We thought it was just a silly ghost story, but we decided to spend the night there and document everything with our cameras. We never expected what happened next. The mausoleum was an old, crumbling structure on the outskirts of town. It sat in the middle of an overgrown cemetery, hidden behind tall trees and thick bushes. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the gravestones. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. "Are you guys ready for this?" Jonah, the bravest of our group, asked as he set up his camera. "Ready as we'll ever be," I replied, trying to sound confident even though my stomach was doing flips. We pushed open the heavy iron door of the mausoleum and stepped inside. The air was cold and musty, and our flashlights barely pierced the darkness. The walls were lined with rows of crypts, each one marked with a name and a date. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like tattered curtains. We set up our sleeping bags in the center of the room and sat down to eat our snacks. It was just after midnight when things started to get weird. The temperature dropped suddenly and we could see our breath in the air. The sound of footsteps echoed through the mausoleum. But when we shone our flashlights around, there was no one there. "Did you guys hear that?" Laura whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," Jonah replied, his voice shaking. "But there's no one here." We huddled together, our flashlights darting around the room. Suddenly the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging us into darkness. Our cameras flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. "Guys, we need to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's just sit down and wait it out." We sat back down, our backs against the cold stone wall. That's when we noticed something strange. One of our friends, Mark, was acting weird. He was staring blankly at the wall, his eyes glazed over. His face was pale, and he was mumbling something under his breath. "Mark, are you okay?" Laura asked, touching his shoulder. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to look at us with a creepy, twisted smile. His eyes were dark and empty, like he wasn't really there. "What's wrong with him?" Jonah asked, panic rising in his voice. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out of here." But no matter how hard we tried, the door wouldn't open. We were trapped in that dark, cold mausoleum with a possessed friend. Mark started to laugh, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. He stood up and walked over to one of the crypts, his movements jerky and unnatural. "He's here," Mark said in a voice that wasn't his own. "The caretaker is here." We watched in horror as Mark pried open the crypt and pulled out a rusty old key. He turned to us, his eyes glowing with a strange light. "You're all going to die," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. We screamed and tried to run, but the room seemed to shift and change around us. It was like we were trapped in a nightmare, reliving the caretaker's sinister deeds. We saw flashes of his cruel smile as he tormented the people buried in the crypts, his laughter echoing through the mausoleum. "Please, let us go," Laura cried, tears streaming down her face. But Mark, or whatever had taken over Mark, just laughed. "There's no escape," he said. "You're trapped here forever." We huddled together, praying for a way out. That's when I remembered the stories about the caretaker. They said he was obsessed with keys, always locking and unlocking doors. Maybe, just maybe, the key Mark had found could help us escape. "Guys, "We need to get that key," I whispered. Jonah nodded, his face set with determination. We waited until Mark was distracted, then lunged at him, knocking the key out of his hand. Laura grabbed it and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. The door creaked open just as Mark let out a blood-curdling scream. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the mausoleum, not stopping until we were far away from the cemetery. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. Mark was still possessed, but as soon as we crossed the cemetery gates, he collapsed, unconscious. When he woke up, he had no memory of what had happened. We never went back to that mausoleum, and we never talked about that night again. But the memory of those dark, haunted eyes and that twisted smile still haunts me. I can only hope that the caretaker's ghost is finally at peace, and that we'll never have to relive that nightmare again. Ever since my husband Tim passed away, I've been visiting his grave every night. It's the only place I feel close to him anymore. The cemetery is quiet and peaceful, with rows of tombstones stretching out under the moonlight. I usually sit by his grave, talking to him about my day, even though I know he can't hear me. One night, as I was sitting there, I started hearing whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized the whispers were coming from the surrounding tombstones. I felt a chill run down my spine, but curiosity got the best of me. I listened closely, trying to make out the words. The whispers spoke of dark secrets, secrets about the people buried there and how they met their untimely ends. One tombstone belonged to a man named Henry, who had died in a mysterious fire. The whispers told me that Henry had been involved in something sinister, something that led to his death. Another tombstone belonged to a woman named Mary, who had drowned under suspicious circumstances. The whispers said that Mary had known too much about something dark and dangerous. As the nights went by, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They told me about a cult that had once used the cemetery for human sacrifices. The cult had long since disappeared, but the restless spirits of their victims remained, trapped in the cemetery. The more I listened, the more I realized that the whispers were trying to tell me something important, something I needed to know. One night, I heard the whispers clearer than ever. They spoke of a ritual that had been performed in the cemetery many years ago. The cult had sacrificed innocent people to some dark force, hoping to gain power and immortality. The spirits of the victims had never found peace and were now demanding justice. They wanted me to uncover the truth and bring the cult to light. I was terrified, but I couldn't ignore the whispers. I felt a strange sense of duty, a need to help the restless spirits find peace. I began researching the history of the cemetery and the cult. The more I learned, the more horrified I became. The cult had been responsible for countless deaths, their dark rituals hidden away from the world. A few nights later, as I was sitting by Tim's grave, the whispers took on a new tone. They weren't just telling me about the past anymore, they were giving me a choice. They demanded that I join them or face their wrath. I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, and I knew I had to make a decision. I couldn't join them. I couldn't become part of the darkness that had taken so many lives. But I also couldn't just walk away. I had to find a way to help the spirits find peace without sacrificing myself. I spent days and nights in the cemetery, listening to the whispers, trying to understand what they wanted from me. One night, the whispers led me to an old, forgotten part of the cemetery. There, hidden among the overgrown weeds and crumbling tombstones, I found a small stone altar. It was covered in strange symbols and dried bloodstains. I knew this was where the cult had performed their rituals, where they had sacrificed innocent lives. The whispers grew louder, urging me to do something, but I didn't know what. I felt a cold breeze, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The spirits were restless, their anger and sorrow palpable. I knelt by the altar, my heart pounding in my chest. I spoke to the spirits, promising them that I would bring the truth to light, that I would make sure the world knew about the cult and their evil deeds. The whispers seemed to calm, and I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. I knew I had to keep my promise no matter what. The next day, I went to the local library and started digging through old newspapers and records. I found articles about the mysterious deaths, the disappearances, and the rumors of a cult operating in the area. I gathered as much information as I could and took it to the authorities. At first, they were skeptical, but as I showed them the evidence, they began to take me seriously. An investigation was launched, and soon, the dark history of the cult was brought to light. The cemetery became a place of interest, and the story of the cult and their sacrifices made headlines. As the truth came out, I felt a sense of relief. The whispers in the cemetery grew quieter, and I knew the spirits were finally finding peace. I continued to visit Tim's grave, but now, the cemetery felt different. It wasn't just a place of sorrow and death. It was a place of justice and redemption. I never thought my life would take such a strange turn, but in the end, I was glad I listened to the whispers. They led me to uncover the truth, to help the restless spirits find peace. And though I still miss Tim every day, I know he's proud of what I did. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.